Happy Monday, Kevin. How are you today?
Good. I missed you last week.
Yeah, it felt like an interminably long week, not rounding up the news of the week on
There is
Monday.
too much healthcare news to skip a week for a holiday, Martin.
It really Memorial Day really if we feel behind.
Yes,
Um, how was your weekend?
it was good. Full of kids' dance recitals, which was a fun life experience.
On Friday night, did you hear a audible sigh of relief from the general direction of Elevance's Indianapolis HQ?
I thought I caught wind of something, but tell me about what went on Friday.
Well, I think you'd have to call it thumb drive gate. We talked about this a few weeks back, months back. But Elevance had been sending their risk adjustment scores via thumb drive. And
According to CMS, right?
allegedly, in their most recent earnings call, Elevance recorded a $935 million accrual, saying we think we might owe CMS some money. And then on Friday night, CMS published this letter saying, Elevance, we're not pausing or not allowing future enrollment. We're not allowing future enrollment for Elevance, but they still have some more stuff to do.
Yeah, but it was an intermediate step, right? It's not like Elevance is fully in the clear, because as I read it, you can kind of see it in this Dear Miss Daily on May 28th as required in step 2. There's 4 steps to this process that they have to clear by the end of the month, right? For them to make it through the steps. This was just like, you made it through step 2, so we're not going to stop enrollments yet. Yes. But Elevance, nonetheless, like if I recall, I don't know if it was their last earnings call or investor call, what have you, but they don't seem too worried that there's going to be any material issue.
Yeah. I will point out that in the letter, CMS is like, thanks for the wire transfer. And I'm very curious to see how much of that $935 million accrual ended up being transferred to CMS.
Yes. Are we pronouncing Elevance wrong? Elevance?
Elevance.
Elevance. Yeah, that's what I thought. Elevance.
Man, now I'm going to be in my head about this. You know how FBI agents have those cool windbreakers that you see when they're doing raids?
When I see, yeah.
I mean, I don't think that you've seen them probably personally, but just like
I've seen
on
them on TV. Yes.
Yeah. I wonder if Medicare Part C and D Oversight and Enforcement Group has windbreakers.
I don't know. Perhaps we should look at Dr. Oz's videos on Twitter these days for some insight into that, because I think they have a lot more enforcement videos going on these days.
I think it'd be good for morale if they got a cool windbreaker. I feel like CMS enforcement probably doesn't get. There's no action shows of like Law and Order, CMS OIG division.
I'm telling you, man, at the rate we're going, there very well might be. What was the health system that started the content studio? Was it Northwell in New York?
Yeah.
Remember that news a couple years back? They were starting content studio for TV shows like The Pit and stuff. You never know.
Yeah. Well, as you alluded to earlier, we got lots to get through today. Lots to round up on the Grand Roundup. We're going to talk about how many $100 billion health AI admin companies can the market support. I think it's probably less than you think. And then over in health law, Kevin, what are we talking about today?
Clover's Star case provides some big updates potentially for Future Stars program, Medicare Advantage more broadly. Lots of other legal updates as well. No Surprises Act saw a provider group in Texas suing Blue Cross of Texas in an interesting legal case there. CVS has a case going on in Tennessee over PBM legislation there. UnitedHealth Group is being sued by the Massachusetts Attorney General. Lots of legal cases to unpack this week.
Well, I'm glad one of us attended some law school.
Only half of law school, Martin.
Yeah, it's about half more than I did. It's still very hard to be a regional health plan. So Providence Health Plan, PHP, is shuttering it completely. PacificSource is exiting the ACA and the entire state of Montana. And then later on, we're welcoming Amit Shah, president of Virta Health, to talk about what it was like to be focused on metabolic disorders before they were cool in the GLP-1 era. And Michelle Turner, who runs a company called Here Now Health and is focused on a little-known aspect of state Medicaid agencies, which provide Medicaid to foster youth and young adults who've aged out of the foster system. But first, a word from our sponsor. Over to you, Kevin.
Martin, today's show is brought to you by our sponsor, Ursa Health. If you're exploring or operating in specialty value-based care, Health Tech Nerds is hosting a sponsored learning event on Wednesday, June 24th, 12 p.m. Eastern. We think you should join. We're bringing together Atlas Oncology Partners and Ursa to go deep on developing, negotiating, and managing multi-state, multi-payer contracts. If you're in the value-based care space, I can't think of a more relevant topic. Learn more and register at luma.com/HTN-Ursa, URSA-Atlas, ATLAS.
Really looking forward to this. I feel like the cancer value-based care, oncology value-based care contracts have to be some of the most fascinating value-based care contracts to negotiate.
For sure. I mean, we hear about it all the time with Evolent on their public earnings calls and others. There's so much variability in the oncology space, and with the cost of drugs and the outcomes associated with them, it's an interesting market. Excited to learn more.
So let's do some level setting, Kevin. How many $100 billion healthcare companies are there before we talk specifically about AI companies?
In the healthcare services area?
Well, yeah. So let's say X pharma and X medical device.
United, CVS, HCA is flirting with it, but not quite there.
And that's it.
That's it. The acquired guys in their podcast speculated that Epic could potentially be valued at 100 billion, like as they were going through the scarcity of that asset, and like if a big tech company could acquire it. Personally, I think that's like I don't think it's that high. You think about Epic's revenue at the size it is. I think Epic, I was looking at this over the weekend. I think Epic per Forbes data in 2024 was bringing in like 5 billion of revenue. Which
would be a pretty sporty multiple.
A 20x revenue multiple for a company that mature, yes, seems pretty sporty. To steal Molina's favorite phrase on company valuations. So there's not many of them. Now, medical devices, pharma, that's an entirely different case. As we were discussing this morning, you have companies like Intuitive Surgical, which is one of the most fascinating entrepreneurial case studies in healthcare that nobody has spent enough time on. Outside of like the medical device investment bankers who follow them and whatnot. Intuitive Surgical is worth $150 billion right now for its surgical robot platform. I mean, it's wild to think about the disconnect in valuations in that market. Eli Lilly's got to be pushing $1 trillion at this point, right? So different worlds.
A whole different world. I mean, there was when Novo introduced their GLP-1, it like increased the GDP of Denmark so significantly that they had to start reporting at X Novo. Yeah, it is $100 billion valuations, pretty high. When I was thinking through this, I think you could also make an argument similar to Epic for Kaiser, that maybe Kaiser's in the neighborhood, though not public, or even for profit.
I would have guessed that Kaiser would have been closer to like a Humana, like in the 30, 40 range. But you've got me curious how big. We should do the math on how big Kaiser is and try to guess at what a valuation would be. It's an interesting question to me. I wouldn't think it's there. Nonetheless, I was musing on this question in the Sunday newsletter after Commure announced their recent funding round. I think it was before Memorial Day. I lose track of the weeks given everything going on. They announced a $70 million round at a $7 billion valuation. And what caught my eye about that was Hemant Taneja, a General Catalyst investor who's been very involved with Commure, went on LinkedIn to talk about how if Commure is going to be successful, it needs to Should we pull up the LinkedIn point?
Oh, yeah.
If it's going to make real strides towards future of health insurance, it needs to become a $100 billion company, which is a fascinating concept given what we just talked about here, right? Like, it is not straightforward to think about how a company like this becomes a $100 billion business. It was also interesting in the context of that question to me to hear Commure's CEO go on the Sorcery podcast to talk about the round. And his narrative, in large part, was this kind of Rockefeller-esque, we're going to build Standard Oil, we're going to acquire the industry to build a dominant platform via M&A and acquisition, which is a reasonable theory of the case. Clearly, it's worked for titans of industry in this country historically. I think it's also a curious case to unpack here in the healthcare industry. The CEO himself, as he was noting on the podcast, at one point he talked about how he wants to eviscerate point solutions, and he'll do so with glee. And that is what Commure is attempting to do in the space. Point solutions are going to fall to the wayside as these platforms come in, take over relationships with clients, and we're going to see a lot of point solutions go under or become part of these broader platforms. And Commure is going to become this platform from their point of view. It was also interesting to note that Commure itself wins a lot of health system relationships by starting as a point solution and doing the classic land and expand play of you go in as point solution, you slowly take over contracts, which invites the question of like, how do you know who's going to win in this environment? If everybody starts off as a point solution and everybody has the same thought of we're going to take over the relationship and win as the platform, what ends up winning in that environment, you know?
Two bits of sort of business school trivia for you. One is that Standard Oil, when it got broken up, was actually worth more to the Rockefeller, the Rockefeller shareholders after it got broken up, because there was a significant discount on them all being one company. And so the value to shareholders, I think that probably that feels a little bit different if you're a venture capital investor, but I like the GC folks, like they are hoping to capture all of that value. But in general, there are sort of diseconomies of scale. The other one is, I can't remember which CEO it was, but he said basically, there are only two moves in business, bundling and unbundling. And we are clearly in a bundling era when it comes to healthcare AI solutions, or at least that's the theory of the case. We hear it from K-Health in their announcement with PenMed, basically saying this isn't a point solution play. We are the front door. We are the multi-vendor AI offering for these academic health centers. And yeah, it's a good move to make if you time it right. But eventually everyone starts saying, okay, am I getting overcharged by my one big vendor? And then they start kicking the tires on point solutions. And so to me, the question of whether Commure is going to ever hit this $100 billion valuation is, are they timing it right? Is this the moment where we are going to see a acceleration in people dropping point solutions and going after? And I think, there's kind of evidence that, and then the second question being, is Commure the winner in that? But it really requires, it's like a dependent on the first question. We're seeing evidence kind of go both ways. And I'm curious to hear your view on this, because we saw Conifer Health get tucked back into UHS, basically on the opposite theory that AI was going to help the partner in that joint venture, the big
Common
health
Spirit.
system, Common Spirit, do rev cycle on their own, like bring it in house.
Yeah.
They were gonna go out and buy point solutions for where they needed it. And so I don't know, what do you make of that?
Yeah. I was actually pulling up the Common Spirit Conifer tenant transaction as an example of this, because I think it's a good case study of the failure mode here as we start to go through this bundling cycle, which, to your point, I think is very much happening, and we're seeing it with Commure. We saw it with Innovaccer acquiring the RCM startup it acquired the other day, we're seeing this play out where you're rolling up point solutions in the platforms. And the natural next step is then, to your point, the unbundling of that. The Common Spirit tenant deal seems like a good example of Common Spirit had Conifer in as its end-to-end administration platform. And it seems like if you're Common Spirit, you're looking at all of the opportunity in AI. You've had this partner. It's not actually materializing in the way that you think in theory it might. And so the natural solution is saying, hey, let's insource this. Let's have a constellation of vendors, each doing specific things, and then our team manages that. So we are using it best internally. And to me, that's kind of the natural evolution of the life cycle that we'll see over time. And it all comes back to the question of what actually works here. Like it's hard to tell from the outside what's going on inside these organizations, what change is actually happening. Commure is the best example of a company where people across the industry will send us messages being like, I don't know what Commure actually does. I can't tell. And as an outsider, I struggled telling that too, right? I thought it was interesting to hear their CEO on Sorcery talk about their relationship with Summa Health, which is that health system in Ohio that General Catalyst now owns. And the way he described it was essentially saying, we're using it as a proving ground to prove out that we can help save a failing system via implementing solutions like Commure, AI, et cetera. And the way in which he described what's going on at Summa is essentially a whole bunch of forward deployed engineers on the ground in the health system trying to save the health system, trying to identify opportunities for better margin efficiency, to implement those, to make it work better. And it's an entirely logical play in my mind to try to run. It's also the same play. Like, I worked in a health system. Any health system person will tell you there have been teams of consultants who have come through these systems before to identify efficiency opportunities with mixed success, right? We just saw a paper looking at the impact of consultants over time on health system margins, and it found, I think, zero impact, right? So it highlights the struggle. You can also see the opportunity with an AI to rethink that, potentially do it better. I wrote in the newsletter, like, if I'm thinking about the bull case, bear case on these things, the bull case is essentially a Palantir for healthcare like model. You take consultants, you turn them into more software focused, forward deployed engineers, and you go transform these organizations. And you do it in a way that they couldn't do it from the inside. You actually do generate margin improvement, and that leads to more success. Now, in healthcare, Health Catalyst, I actually think, is like a really good counterpoint to that, right? Because Health Catalyst is sitting out there on the public markets at $100 million market cap right now, which wasn't that dissimilar. Like, the health system I worked for, Martin, we sold our data analytics team. Like, the data analytics team was outsourced to Health Catalyst, a big public transaction right around when they were going public originally, on that general theory, right? Like, Health Catalyst can do data analytics better for a system to improve margins, to improve efficiency. They're sitting at $100 million, not $100 billion.
Yeah, I think you have, the Palantir comp is like, I think I'm looking at it right now, 382.97 billion. So yeah, you would much rather be compared to Palantir than Health Catalyst. But I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure I can point to what the difference in the narrative is besides sentiment on those two. And you've made this point a couple times, but if there is going to be a Palantir of healthcare, why not Health Catalyst, which has the relationships, the engineers in the big health systems and in those markets today?
Yeah. I mean, the only answer to that question that makes sense to me is it being a statement about management and investors and their thoughts on management's ability to execute on that transition moving forward. Like, to me, that's the only logical explanation there. Because, to your point, you've got the contracts and relationships. You should be able to help your customers navigate this changing environment via those relationships, right? Which I actually think is a big opportunity for Health Catalyst if they can figure that out. So it'll be interesting to watch. If I'm thinking about the original question here of how many billion-dollar AI healthcare admin platforms will there be, I don't know that I think it's a. If I step back, I could certainly see, going back to the beginning of the conversation, the companies today that are around $100 billion, United, CVS, HCA is not quite there, but close. I could see a scenario 20 years from now, 10 years from now, where you and I are talking, and there's a new $100 billion services business that started taking off in this era, similar to United started really taking off to become the company it is today in late 2000s, right? I think if I break down what it takes to become that $100 billion company, to your point, I don't think you are just a services provider to HCA as your main client. Like the idea that Commure or any company is going to be larger than HCA, I don't fully buy. But what I could see is like go back to the Sorcery podcast and this Rockefeller-esque ambition of rolling up a market. If Summa does work and they figure out that they can improve margins at a system, I don't know what's stopping them from taking that playbook to other systems across the country and expanding what they think of their business as to become a more efficient way of running healthcare in this country. And that's where all of a sudden it's like, I don't think it's very likely. I would not be betting on this happening, but I can at least tell myself a narrative like, okay, if they can figure out how to run a health system with 5% better margins, 10% better margins through the use of AI, and they are deploying it in these systems by buying them via Commure or whatever entity it is, that Tanisha is a big enough thinker that he could try to go roll up the space. Again, likelihood low. But to me, that is like, if I'm trying to articulate the bull case of how Tunisia gets there and we get this $100 billion company that's moving towards this health assurance future he's talking about, it is through that kind of scale, right?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of health systems who could use a 5 to 10% bump in operating profitability. And so if that is the case, like that is a sort of pretty obvious buy. You take and roll up a bunch of struggling health systems. Could you do the same thing with like regional health plans? That's another thing we've talked about.
Martin, maybe you even launch provider-sponsored health plans that actually work because you have AI that can understand how sick people are, and you can proactively intervene earlier because you own the doctors. But then you're a vertically integrated entity that is being broken up by DC at the moment. So
yes.
I don't know.
It seems tough. Well, I think it's time for us to move on to health law. I want to start with Clover. So Clover stock jumped 16% on Thursday after a judge tossed several star metrics and asked CMS to recalculate some other star metrics. I spent a little time in Claude on Thursday morning trying to figure out.
Dangerous.
Yes, it's very dangerous. No, but just trying to get like basically a rough cut of like who are the other health plans that plausibly could benefit here. And Clover, based on my sort of quick read, was the one that was closest, like right on the bubble, basically, where if you toss these star metrics, if you have CMS recalculate these other star metrics, they could go up from 3.5 to 4 stars. That would be worth like 120 million to them, which would be really meaningful. CMS is appealing, so I think it's a big TBD on whether that will be, you can count that as 120 million in Clover's accounts. But I thought that Andrew Schwab on LinkedIn had an interesting point, and you talked about this a little bit in the newsletter on, between this and Chevron, is this the, sort of, are we entering a new era of stars? Can you walk us through what Chevron is a little bit?
Yes. So the idea is that the Supreme Court overturned one of the key doctrines that argues that it changes the way we look at the history of how um, federal agencies interpret statutes. And so it calls into question a whole bunch of interpretations of various statutes. And so Andrew's point on LinkedIn, which I thought was a good one, is that when you take a ruling like this, which is like in the minutia of what stars measures are in or out and how do we evaluate that, it calls into question the entire program and what's ahead for it. And to me, that's the interesting point here. There are a few other LinkedIn posts that I saw too that um, they raise the point that this introduces a whole bunch of uncertainty in the program. Right? You mentioned CMS is appealing. This isn't going to be resolved anytime in the near future, I wouldn't think, given how our legal system tends to work and how long it takes to decide these sorts of things. Uh, is it today that bids are due
Yeah.
for next year? So like you can imagine the amount of uncertainty when you don't know how this is going to play out. You see Clover having this result, which is a great result for Clover that has its stock price bump. You can imagine the product teams are having to go through essentially two different scenarios of planning of like, what if stars changes meaningfully in the future as a result of this versus what if the federal government wins this case and this doesn't materialize. But it's a lot more uncertainty for the program, and you really got to know what you're doing and be placing bets on what's going to happen here if you're filing product right now in the future Medicare Advantage. So it's, to me, it's this interesting. We've talked a lot over recent months with the advance notice to final notice and all of the changes about how it's hard to operate in an uncertain environment for these businesses. And it's more of that, right? So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Good for Clover for bringing the case and winning it. Clearly, their stock benefited from that, but it's going to be fascinating to watch, I think, ahead.
Yeah. I think that the other piece of it, right? So there's the bid strategy, but then there's also just the day-to-day blocking and tackling that you need to do to get your star scores. And if 10 measures are getting thrown out and you've built a team that's like focused on med adherence or whatever, you have a med adherence tiger team who's going after those measures, they might need to be focused on something else if those are not the measures that and so it is a it touches bid strategy, but it also touches just like day-to-day operational blocking and tackling, and so pretty major, something to watch.
And it's interesting to see the list of plans on this too. Like if you're devoted and you're sitting at 3.5 stars and the implication of this change is that you could get to 4 stars, I'm sure that's a meaningful adjustment for them too. We don't know as much of their financial situation because they're not public, but man, it's going to be fascinating to watch how this plays out.
It sure is. Over in the Bay State, Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Attorney General filed a lawsuit against UnitedHealthcare, alleging over $100 million in D-SNP upcoding over an 11-year period. Don't have much to say on the merits of the case, but the lawsuit is a interesting read into the complexity of the duals market. You flagged this chart. I am interested in the duals market for a lot of reasons. It's like a sort of state, federal, Medicare, Medicaid combined program. And this is Massachusetts saying, hey, we think that we paid too much for some of these plans because, we're alleging that UnitedHealthcare was saying they were sicker than they were. I think that as the market is generally pretty bullish on dual and SNP plans at the moment, and it is interesting to see that bullishness also sort of start to trickle into some regulatory pushback on a much tighter timeline than we have seen in it's like the run up to the sort of Medicare Advantage gold rush. Like that was many years where the market was really excited about it, and then finally regulators got interested, and clearly regulators have learned their lesson and are see where the puck is going, and they're starting to kick the tires on these things.
Yep. If you want to understand D-SNP plans and how complicated it is to operate these things, I think it's well worth going through this legal filing to get into the little details of, it's laid out on this chart. You've got level 1, level 2, level 3. You've got nurses going out to do assessments of people. It's a complicated program to execute in. And if you're looking at going to work for a company in the space, investing in companies in the space, I think it's worth thinking through the complexity of it and the political, the legal dynamics around all of that in today's environment. It's going to be interesting to keep an eye on.
No Surprises Act still in the news. So a couple of things going on here. Do you want to start by talking about what the heck is going on in Texas?
So I don't know how Blue Cross of Texas seems to be taking the brunt of so much of this, but there were 2 press releases from different provider groups in Texas in the past couple weeks. One, Radiology Associates of North Texas, which it seems like they did an internal analysis of No Surprises Act IDR, the Independent Dispute Resolution Process results. And they basically said Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas is not paying out claims as they should. They are upset because technically, right, you go through this IDR process. Is binding arbitration the right phrase for it? At the end of the arbitration, regardless of whether or not you agree with the result, legally you have to pay. And their point is Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas has only paid 2% of the awarded balances. This radiology group has incurred more than $51 million alone in administrative waste as part of this program. Neither of those data points seem particularly good. I can imagine the reason why Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas is only paying 2% relates to the other press release that came out, which was from Halo MD, which is the kind of most well-known, I'll call it, actor in the No Surprises Act process. It has done very well as the model has come up. There have been a number of articles written about the model, the founders, etc. But Halo MD issued a press release after they won a legal case against Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas as a federal court judge dismissed the case on the whole. If you are interested in this topic, I would highly recommend looking at these legal documents, going back to the initial complaint from Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas, because the complaint is essentially about how Halo MD is abusing the process, driving a whole bunch of claims through it and increasing costs. The reason why Halo MD wins the case has nothing to do with that argument. It has everything to do with this is the law. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas needs to abide by the law, and you need to pay out these claims. So I imagine what Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas is doing is they're withholding payment until these legal cases are resolved, because they are saying all of these claims going through the program shouldn't be going through the program. The providers are saying, yes, they should pay us for them. And the providers are winning that case. And I would, given the couple cases we've seen in this market, I think the providers are going to keep winning that case. And regardless of what we think of the overall impact of the No Surprises Act, good or bad, it's one of these examples of it's now the rule of the land, and we've got to follow it, right? And so it's interesting to see and think about how it might change going forward as a result of that. Did you look at the modifications coming out of DC last week on No Surprises Act? Any take on what was coming out of that?
So the IDR operations rule was proposed 4 years ago under the Biden administration, and they just kind of never got around to finalizing it. So they finally finalized the rule. And we had Lauren Adler from Brookings on last week. He kind of gave us a preview and said, look, this isn't going to solve any of the problems that people complain about. It's an operations rule. It's technical in nature. It is not that interesting. And he was correct. It is it's a technical rule. My take on the IDR rule after looking through it was it is streamlining the process. And what happens if you make the current process more efficient is probably on the margin. We're going to get more No Surprise Act claims. And, prices are probably going to continue to go up. We didn't solve the problem. The CMS can't solve the problem. This is something that Congress needs to do. And so making the system more efficient is nice and well and good, but it is now a more efficient system of taking premium dollars and turning them into large, some might say above market payments to Halo MD. And that's great for Halo MD and their docs and their shareholders, and bad if you have insurance. But that's the law. I don't know. If you're BCBS Texas, like, you are free to avail yourself of the legal system and to lobby Congress and do those things, but you gotta pay.
Yeah, to me, if I'm advising Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas, it seems like the wrong strategy to not pay docs for the outcomes, regardless of what you think of them, because to your point, it is the law, and you should know that it is political ammo at the very least for providers to issue the press releases that they are, to then go to DC and make the case of, hey, insurers aren't playing fair. And when you've got a data point out there publicly, like Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas is only paying 2% of what they're supposed to, that's a tough data point to have out there if you're the payer community. I am fascinated to see how this conversation evolves. To your point, it seems like it's not going to go anywhere. We've now created a cottage industry around this process. As we discussed often, profit pools do not tend to shrink willingly. They tend to go up over time. And I would guess that's what's going to happen here. We're going to see a bigger and bigger industry around this concept. But like, going back to kind of first principle, like when this legislation was created, it was all about how do we reduce surprise bills for the consumer, right? That was essentially what the process was around. And to me, I don't think we would have much disagreement in this country that surprise bills are a bad thing and we should do away with them. To me, it is a really good example, though, this legislation, of the unintended consequences of you try to solve that problem by getting in the middle of what is fundamentally a fight between payers and providers over how they contract with each other and what the underlying rate is. And you don't solve that fight. You just create a new forum to have it. And it's not surprising that like both parties continue having that fight within that forum, right? And you don't actually change the underlying issue. And so, yes, we don't have surprise medical bills anymore. That's a good thing. But also, we have higher premiums in states, presumably, because now insurance are paying those higher bills. And it all comes back to what problem are we trying to solve here? And for who, you know?
I've said before, and I will continue to make the case, that I think the No Surprises Act is a I think we should call a success a success, in that it is good that people can't get balance billed anymore because payers and provider groups can't come to an agreement on, an anesthesiology rate. And to solve that problem, you need to make someone unhappy. You either need to pay the anesthesiologist more than the payers want to pay them, or you need to pay the anesthesiologist less than they want to be paid. And one of the things that's interesting now, if you think about the dynamics of the negotiation, is payers are probably more interested in coming back to the negotiating table and offering a more fair and maybe even a little bit painful to them price for anesthesiology or ER docs or whatever is getting these claims. But if you're Halo MD, why would you say yes to that? Like, you have the payers over a barrel at the moment. And so the time to strike a good deal was a while ago. And now, if you're a provider group and the No Surprises Act is working for you, like, what's the incentive for you to come to the table, even if the payers are like, yeah, this is painful, and the regulators are going to start getting interested in our solvency if we have to pay out all of these things.
Yeah.
So CVS is suing Tennessee, and that's the last bit from the health law corner. basically, Tennessee became the second state in the United States to pass a law saying that PBMs and pharmacies have to be separate. They can't be owned.
Arkansas was the first.
Arkansas was the first, and there's lawsuits ongoing in Arkansas on that law as well. It is one of those things where if you just describe to someone, should the insurance company also be able to own a pharmacy? You kind of like, I don't know. That seems a little conflicted. And the law forces divestiture. So basically, CVS, Caremark would have to divest all of its pharmacies and specialty pharmacies. For CVS, that's a big deal because CVS is, one of the largest PBMs and also the only large publicly traded retail pharmacy. So this is a big case for them, and I think a bit of a headache, especially if other states pick up the torch from Tennessee and start going after this.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I was curious about in reading about this case over the weekend was like, why is it just CVS seemingly suing, given CVS is one of three big PBMs? As I understand it, CVS is the only one that operates both the PBM and the pharmacy business in Tennessee. So it sounds like this legislation is like specifically going after CVS in the state of Tennessee, which I can see why they wouldn't take too kindly to that change.
Yeah, in Arkansas, I believe it is Cigna and Express Scripts who is leading the lawsuit there. But you have to imagine all of the PBMs. I forget what the name of their catchy name of their trade association is. They're all like, yeah, we got to stop this because this is both our business model today, but also what we've kind of premised a lot of our future growth on is this specialty pharmacy PBM integration. And we can't do that if it is illegal.
Yep. I was reading the Tennessee Lookout had some good local coverage of this, and it highlights how complicated all of this is, right? CVS has spent a bunch of money trying to push against this legislation, but also the trade group in Tennessee, the Tennessee Pharmacists Association, seems to have strong political sway pushing for independent pharmacies in the state. And so you can imagine all the local political dynamics at play in a scenario like this of you've got the independent physicians or pharmacists, who are in the state Senate and whatnot. And it's a challenging environment in that scenario.
Yeah. The independent pharmacists are a huge winner if all of this business, if Caremark has to go and do deals with all of them.
That's the whole theory of the case, right? Like this is intended to support those independent pharmacies, which on its face isn't, I can't push back on the idea of supporting independent pharmacies. I don't know. It's complicated.
Yeah. It will be interesting to get a sort of survey of people with takes on this about whether prices will increase, decrease, or remain the same in Tennessee and Arkansas on a sort of pre and post basis.
For sure.
All right. Excuse me. So very quickly, today's show is also brought to you by Abridge. Abridge is on a mission to save time, money, and lives. On June 11th, Abridge is hosting its first ever keynote live from New York City and streaming globally. I've already registered, looking forward to it. Join Abridge CEO and founder Shiv Rao for a live presentation on the most significant step towards that goal to date. The link to register for the live stream will be in the show notes, but you can also register at events.abridge.com/keynote. Really looking forward to this. Always like hearing what Shiv has to say and seeing the vision for beyond the ambient scribe, like what's going on here.
For sure. I listened to his podcast on 20VC. Is that what it's 20VC the other day? And he is one of the most kind of mission vision aligned founders in the space right now. It'll be fun to hear what they have cooking.
Yeah. So I want to go back to a sort of evergreen theme on this show, which is that it is hard to be a regional not-for-profit health plan. I show this chart all of the time. I think, my friends and loved ones are sick of seeing it and hearing about it. There was more news, though, this week, more sort of points of evidence for why it's hard to be a regional non-for-profit. What happened, Kevin?
So we saw two more plans. This time, both plans in the Pacific Northwest announce plans to exit various markets. Providence Health Plan, they'll be shutting down all lines of businesses. Well, they'll be shutting down its ACA, Medicaid, employer businesses in 2027. It sounds like they're still, they think that they will have a national carrier to take on the Medicare Advantage business. So those members will transition over to whomever the national carrier is. So technically they'll just get transitioned over. That line of business won't be fully shut down. Nonetheless, Providence is exiting that line of business after some serious financial issues over the past couple of years. They lost $100 million in 2025, which is what ultimately drove the shutdown. There was some interesting local coverage of kind of the collapse of the plan and how that changed over time. If you, the Williamette Week is what the local newspaper is called. Anyways, it provides a really interesting kind of journey through Providence Health Plan from the era pre-COVID into today, and highlighted how the plan has struggled over the last couple of years, right? There's been leadership changes. Leadership came in and was, according to the article, perhaps more focused on bringing in, Silicon Valley startups and partnering with those, wasn't entirely focused on core management of the plan, which, again, also to an ongoing theme of ours, a lot of the success of these sorts of plans, it's just basic blocking and tackling and focusing on what you need to do well, and then getting to scale so you can do that well. It's unfortunate for Providence, which I think they started in like the 1980s on this health plan. And it goes to show how quickly, I mean, I saw this in Minneapolis with some of the plan changes here. You have these longstanding institutions in your local markets that have been there for forever, that have been doing really well. And then in the last couple of years, to the point of this chart, things have started going sideways really fast. And all of a sudden, if you're Providence, your health plan's losses start putting the overall entity at risk. And you've got to make some hard decisions, And so in this case, they shut down the health plan. We also saw PacificSource, which is partly owned by a health system, Legacy Health. They're exiting the ACA market entirely, and they're also exiting their full business in Montana. That affects 42,000 members across the couple of states that PacificSource operates in. It's a tough market, Martin. I don't know how else to say it. Yep.
It sure is. So on the sort of vividly, the Providence CEO of the entire group, the health system and the plan, described it as an untenable situation. And I thought that was like a sort of really vivid adjective. It's interesting to think about what this does to the market dynamics, like the payer market dynamics. So ACA, and this is just like a sort of persistent story. Everyone's exiting the ACA markets. Cigna made the announcement earlier this year. And it seems like with the ACA, like we need more concentration to make this potentially profitable for ACA plans. And so one way that happens is, a payer drops out and now there's fewer options and they can charge more. Medicaid, they didn't talk about this explicitly, but you and I have theorized that like the big Medicaid plans have to be kicking the tires on the Medicaid book of business. Molina called this out at their investor day and said, look, when when a Medicaid plan is going out of business, we can acquire it for just basically the cost of regulatory capital. We just sort of move the account, move it into an account in that state, and 20% of revenue or whatever it is. And I wouldn't be surprised to see Centene or Molina end up with the old PHP Medicaid book. And then employers, like, where does that land? It lands at the, Elevance, Cigna, or United.
Yep. It was interesting to see in that Willamette Week coverage of Providence. I hadn't heard this story before, but they called out a partnership that Providence had with Collective Health, calling it a disastrous launch disrupting healthcare for thousands. The two companies insist the situation have improved, but numerous providers, patients continue to report serious issues. It's an interesting kind of blending of innovation world with these plans, and how you can imagine a plan leader wanting to be forward thinking and innovative, particularly for the employer market, is bringing in a partner like Collective to come try to change the trajectory of the plan. It does not seem to have worked in this situation, which again is just, it's indicative of the challenge here. I thought it was funny. I was reading on JAMA's Twitter feed. They had a new article posted this morning, yesterday morning, about the growth in provider sponsored health plans between 2018 and 2023. Noting that hospitals owning health plans have gone up from 18% to 27% between 2018 and 2023, which you can almost predict what the updated version of that from 2023 to 2026 would be, which is we're going to see those start to go back down. But it was indicative. I mean, having worked in the health system between 2018 2020 period, there was a lot of appetite and interest in owning these plans. And the theory of it makes total sense to me, Martin. Like, I think that is why we keep running at this concept as an industry of if you own the provider who has the trusted relationship with the patient, and so much of the problem theoretically in the industry is the friction points between payers and providers, should you not be able to solve that almost entirely by just having the provider own the plan in the local market? The theory of that, it's really enticing, right? The practice of it is hard from an actuarial risk perspective, because at the end of the day, it's tough being an insurance business.
Yeah, I would love to talk to, even off the record, one of these, because it seems to my intuition on this, and I know that this is a little bit naive, but it's like the biggest expense, like a single line item expense, is your hospital for your plan. Like, can you not figure out a way to do a deal there so that you are getting your medical expenses at your hospital? And maybe it is like, it's hard to steer your, but I find it baffling.
Yeah, it is hard to square, but it clearly this, we've seen multiple runs of this idea of the provider sponsored health plans, some more successful than others. We've talked about Clover a little bit in this call. Clover essentially started as a provider sponsored health plan in New Jersey with the plans that it's or with the system that its founding CEO was part owner of, right? Like, that's where it got its start. That's where it has its highest density. And it seemingly is doing pretty well in operating that plan, right?
Yeah.
Bright, more or less, when it started, before it got over its skis in terms of its ambitions, was pretty close to a provider-sponsored plan as well, right? And Colorado market, where it first launched with, is it Centura that was there, Martin?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they just had closely integrated partnership, HMO product offering, acquired the membership out of the failed co-op, and had a really tightly knit offering in partnership with that plan. The theory of it is like, it's great. I go back and I read that Bessemer Bright initial investment thesis, and I'm like, yeah, this is awesome. This is it. Bessemer has now taken that down subsequently, which is indicative of how Bright played out on the public markets, right? Like, you get a little over your skis in growth, which, by the way, is also an underlying theme in so many of these failures, is in this 2018 to 2023 period where growth seemed really enticing in these plans. You got leadership that tried to grow a little too fast, and it put the entire plan at risk. And it's kind of wild how, like, you've got 40 years of operating results that just go poof overnight. because of a couple of years of bad calls from a membership growth perspective.
You would also think that a regional nonprofit would feel less. They obviously have incentive to grow, and they also obviously benefit from scale. But you think that they would feel it a little bit less than the venture-backed and public companies. But I agree. I mean, I think if this graph is any indication of like what the rate of provider-sponsored plans is going to be in 2026 and beyond, it's not great.
Yep. Last thought on this point from me, if I'm Chris Klomp in CMS and I am thinking about how I want to encourage more competition in markets, which they've talked about for Medicare Advantage in particular, provider-sponsored plans seem like they have to be part of the answer, and helping them succeed. It needs to be part of the answer, right? Because otherwise, you get what's happening in Providence Health Plan, where it. Yes, we can see your comments. To the comments that are coming in. You've got Providence Health Plan that is only keeping its MA plan afloat by partnering with the national plan, and that's what they're doing with that membership now, right? So the only way I can see facilitating a competitive market is by figuring out how to have these more local plan offerings succeed, which raises a whole bunch of interesting questions on going back to this concept of leveling the playing field, how you attempt to do that moving forward, because clearly it's not working for these plans at the moment. Maybe 2026 starts to change that. Maybe the results we saw in Q1 persist, and that's a tailwind for these plans now. Be worth keeping an eye on that.
Well, as we keep an eye on it, I think it's time for us to move on to a little ping pong before we bring on our first guest. And so let me, do you want to kick us off with talking about Oura?
Yes. Oura confidentially filed S1 will be worth keeping an eye on as they start going through the IPO process. It's first since we saw Hinge Omada go through IPO process, indicative of the momentum the wellness market has at the moment. I will be really curious to see how closely their S1 resembles the Fitbit S1 from a decade ago now. Fitbit's S1 at the time, if you go back and look at it, was, very much consumer-oriented device, but future growth strategy is in enterprise healthcare. We're going to start selling to employers, whatnot. And that was their strategy at the time. I imagine that Aura's S1 will similarly have a heavy dose of healthcare ambition as it is talking its narrative for future growth and whatnot. And I think they just announced a new product feature update, which I think is indicative of that, right? So they added in health features in this new ring they launched this past week: blood pressure monitoring, nighttime breathing, GLP-1 tracking suite around for folks who are taking GLP-1s. And most interestingly to me was they launched a partnership with Council Health to integrate its virtual AI-driven care delivery model into the Oura experience. I am fascinated to watch how that rolls out over time. And if Oura is, on the public markets giving updates on the business, hopefully they give us updates on how that rollout is functioning. In particular, it seems to have interesting tie-ins to the Access program that we've talked a lot about, in trying to provide AI-centric, technology-centric care to the Medicare population. You can make the parallels there, I think, pretty easily that this might play into that model. We heard from Abe Sutton last week at, I forget which conference, but he hinted that we might see more participants in Access coming up. It would make a ton of sense that Oura joins Withings and Whoop in partaking in that program. So we'll be keeping an eye on that.
It's interesting to see them also start to position themselves as a platform. Health Equity, the HSA administrator, reported earnings last week, and they were it's a small part of their revenue, but a big part of their growth story is this marketplace feature, which includes these rings. And so you have they're getting paid for helping people use their HSA to buy the ring, and then Aura is using their platform to get people to use Council Health, and it is just like platforms upon platforms upon platforms. Fascinating stuff. In your old neck of the woods, it looks like WakeMed got a pretty enticing offer and said, "Oh, no, thank you. That's okay."
Yeah, UNC Health came in with a $5 billion offer per the local reporting that apparently saw the terms of the deal, which is over 2x what Atrium offered them. Nonetheless, WakeMed declined UNC's offer, is continuing to go forth with Atrium's offer, which, if these were public market companies and you got a bid from a company for 2x, you'd have a fiduciary duty to, I think, explain yourself a bit more. Nonetheless, it sounds like that's what WakeMed continues to plan on doing. Interestingly, I mean, there's a ton of tension right now in that local market around what this deal is going to do to healthcare costs. Obviously, there's the general narrative around provider consolidation, increasing cost of care, despite what every health system talks about when they go forward with these mergers. And WakeMed's CEO pretty clearly indicates what's going on here, right? He talked in one of the articles, was talking about how WakeMed is at a competitive disadvantage in the region because it charges 10 to 30% less than its competitors in the region. And that is causing issues for it. So it is, trying to find surer footing. Logically, it makes total sense. I can't fault them for that. Yes, it is a disadvantage if you are charging 30% less than your competitor in the market. That is an issue. It also indicates what's going to happen when WakeMed sells to its competitor. No?
A little bit. I would imagine the PR person's like, you gotta stop saying that. Like the North Carolina regulators are going to make that point for us. You don't need to hit it as part of your pitch. So
Yeah,
we
keep us moving.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say. So we are about to welcome our. I mean, yeah, you go all day. We are going to welcome our first guest. His name is Amit. He's calling in from Denver. Amit, welcome to the show.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
We can hear you great.
Great. Kevin, Martin, it's a joy. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. I said you were calling in from Denver, but I don't actually know if that's the case. Are you?
You're right. I'm calling in from Denver.
Beautiful. Are you at the office today? And beautiful.
I'm at the home office today, not in the Virta office today, but
Nice.
But it is you hit it right, Martin. It's beautiful. It's sunny. We had a little rainstorm last night, and so everything's green and sunny this morning.
We are so excited to chat today. I feel like, you all at Virta have been focused on metabolic disorders since before they became all that anyone could talk about. I'm wondering if you could kind of start and kind of give us a little bit of that backdrop of saying, like, we were focused on metabolic disorders before they were cool. We're now in the GLP-1 era. What's that story been like, and what's that experience been like?
Martin, I'm going to give you the triple threat here. We were focused on metabolic disease before it was cool. We had AI before it was cool, and we were prescribing and deprescribing GLP-1s before it was cool. So we got the triple threat here. Just so your listeners know, if you haven't heard of Virta, we're on a mission to reverse metabolic disease in 1 billion people. We combine medical care, personalized nutrition, and tools like GLP-1s to help people sustainably lose weight and reverse diseases like cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. And we deliver all of our care via a continuous remote care platform. It leverages AI to bring to bear great technology and human clinicians in order to help people sustainably make change. We partner with plan sponsors and help them save money by making people healthier. And so that was a mouthful. But again, it goes back to the triple threat. We started our clinical trial in 2015 in Indiana with patients that had type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. And through publishing, 90-day, 1 year, 2 year, and 5 year data, we have shown that we can fundamentally, using a personalized nutritional protocol, reverse their disease. And what that means is that we help people manage all of these symptoms of metabolic dysfunction. So symptoms of metabolic dysfunction are high blood sugar, high cardiovascular risk, liver disease, kidney disease, weight gain. And so we are able to help people do that using a nutritional protocol that we deliver via our app. I, of course, want to get into a ton more detail, but would love to partner with you on how to do that.
I mean, I'd be curious to hear how conversations with employers and the plan sponsors have changed over the last several years as yeah, it seems like culturally GLP-1s have taken off. I assume every customer of yours is thinking about how, like, what are we doing in terms of GLP-1s, offering them to our employees? How do we navigate the cost of GLP-1s? What's the impact of all of this? Why do we need nutritional programming on the side of GLP-1s? Like, can you walk through what the conversation is like with customers today, how that's changed kind of pre-GLP-1s to now?
Absolutely. I'll start with where we are today, and then I'll do a little bit of the history. Where we are today is you both are absolutely right in your first two questions, where GLP-1s dominate a lot of the conversation. They dominate a lot of the conversation and the mind share for a couple of reasons. Number one is they're a huge driver of cost, as you both know. And number two is that they seem like they are something distinctive and new to help with a problem that a lot of people have. Let's frame the problem that a lot of people have. About 93% of people in America adults in America have some metabolic dysfunction, have some metabolic disorder. 93%, that's almost everyone. And one of the most common ways that shows up is obesity. And so somewhere, depending on what source you look at, it's 60 to 70% of people have obesity. And so when you have a drug that they're marketing as can help with that problem, it ends up being on everyone's radar. If you're a plan sponsor, you're thinking about this. And so that is the most common current version of the conversation. And what that means for us is that we feel like we're in a great spot. Again, we've got over a decade of working with these drugs. Just so people know, GLP-1s, and I think most people on this call will know this, GLP-1s were initially type 2 diabetes drugs and have been so for over 20 years. And so when I say we started our clinical trial in 2015 and worked with patients with type 2 diabetes, many of them were on these drugs. At the time, they were called Ozempic and Mounjaro. They're still called Ozempic and Mounjaro if you're prescribing them for type 2 diabetes. They're just also called Wegovy and Zepbound if you're prescribing them for some of these other indications, like obesity. And so we actually have data to show how we work with patients on these drugs. And what I like to say is that we're the best solution before, during, and after GLP-1 use. Before, it turns out that 65% of people that want to lose weight want to do so without the use of a drug. And the wonderful part about Virta is that we have shown our nutritional approach drives the same weight loss at 1 year out to 2 years as these drugs. And our weight loss, by the way, is on an intent to treat basis. So it's across the population. It's not what is published for these drugs, which is just on the people that stayed on the drug. Okay, but that's okay. So on the way in, on people's way in, we counsel them to take the nutrition pathway, and are honestly about as successful, 60 to 70% as the population would indicate, in getting people to choose that pathway. In terms of during, GLP-1s are a wonderful tool. And because we're a national provider, we actually prescribe them. Number one is around comorbidity. Again, comorbidities, it would make sense to prescribe them. And number two, for people who are very concerned about starting the nutritional protocol, we find it a great way to kickstart their weight loss journey. In addition, when the FDA approved GLP-1s, it said you have to pair it with lifestyle change. And Virta is the proven lifestyle change that you can do with it. And so we find it to be a great kickstart. It does bring down food noise, but by the way, so does our nutritional protocol over time. What you hear is that people reduce their food noise and eat right. And then after, again, the only company with peer-reviewed published data to show that we maintain weight loss out to 18 months post discontinuation of GLP-1s, again, done safely in partnership with our provider group. So anyway, that's the key discussion that's happening today. That obviously saves money. One of our Fortune 100 clients, we recently were able to show them we saved about 50% on GLP-1 spend over the course of a year. Again, 50% while making their people healthier, not just by providing friction, but by and utilization management, but by actually making people healthier. Kevin, you asked about the evolution over time. I'll answer that very quickly and then allow you to direct me to what's next. The evolution over time, I would say, is again, 10 years ago, when we first were selling to, we actually didn't really start our commercialization in earnest until about kind of 6 or 7 years ago. But when we first were selling to these plan sponsors, we initially would tell them about all the metabolic diseases we could solve. And the one they were most interested in was type 2 diabetes because it drove a lot of cost. What GLP-1s have successfully done over the last few years is provided a new price point and cost point for a disease that a lot more people have, like obesity. And so while our earliest customers, US Foods, for example, was one of our early customers, they actually covered Virta for prediabetes and obesity early on. But it wasn't something that was a huge part of our business until GLP-1s took the stage. And so anyway, so that's how the conversation has changed. And now they are the dominant piece of the conversation, is what your GLP-1 strategy is, specifically in the employer space. A little bit different in health plans, but in the employer space, that's a big piece of the conversation.
One of the things I found really fascinating is you've been publishing a lot of stuff recently: serious liver disease, pancreatic cancer, chronic inflammation, stuff that intuitively I don't think of as metabolic disorders or diet related. I'm curious, where does the Virta approach work outside of just the sort of what we would conceive of metabolic disorder?
Yeah. Martin, we love that question. The way I'll go back to that 93% number. I believe that was a Swiss Re report from last year where I pulled that from. 93% of people have metabolic dysfunction. It turns out the root cause of many of these issues is the same. So let's back up. When we think of high blood sugar, a disease of high blood sugar, we think prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and our approach is try to manage that symptom of high blood sugar with medicine. Then we think of high blood pressure, try to manage that with medicine. Then we think of liver disease, MASLD or MASH or NASH, or however, I think the latest is MASLD, try to manage that. There's one drug on the market for that. You think of kidney disease, multiple drugs on that. It turns out that our healthcare system, as you both know, and I heard part of your previous conversation, you talked about this in different ways, is really, it's about managing those symptoms. And so, and a lot of the training that we go through that our physicians go through is about managing each of those individually. And what we've discovered at Virta is that the root cause of all of those things is the same. It's what you eat. And so over the last 10 years, we've been working on that. We've got the only scaled program where we can deliver the results based on helping people change what they eat. And so we just started looking at the claims data sets around that data. Again, we've got hundreds of thousands of patients over a decade. And so as we started looking at the claims data sets, that's where we were able to start really connecting all of these different conditions. And so we looked in claims data and we said, hey, when you solve what people eat, by the way, everybody that was enrolled in Virta over this period, not everybody, the vast majority, over 90% of the people, were in the Virta treatment for type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, or obesity, or overweight. Those are the three conditions you enrolled in Virta for. When we looked at the claims, for the intervention group, the Virta group, compared to folks that were similarly matched, so started with those same, with similar conditions, and over the course of time, we saw a significant reduction in cardiovascular risk, specifically a 54% reduction in major adverse cardiovascular events and death, MACE, significant reduction. And so again, you solve that root cause of the problem, and people are dying of cardiovascular disease a lot less. Same thing in CKD. We looked at the incidence of CKD and CKD progression over in our group versus other group. And it turns out that it got better. By the way, we have additional data on improvements in eGFR. So it's not just that the outcomes got better. We could actually now speak to some of the underlying processes that got better, or the underlying biology that got better. Same in MASLD, and I could go down the list. Recently, you as you mentioned, we just released a paper on inflammation markers and the significant improvement in inflammation. And so I guess when you solve the root cause of that issue, all of those symptoms get better. And at this point, we have peer-reviewed published papers on essentially all the ones I mentioned: depressive symptoms over 2 years, improvements in knee pain. Again, you lose weight, musculoskeletal gets better. And again, it comes from solving the root cause of that problem.
So one of the fascinating parts of this conversation to me, if I think about nutrition as the root cause of the problem, getting people to eat healthier, eat better, solving these various symptoms, that like the theory of that case makes total sense to me. It also seems much easier societally to convince people to just inject themselves with medication that solves it without changing the way they eat, so on and so forth. And that seems like a cultural moment that we're in today. But I also noticed the broader kind of Maha conversation, more focus on food supply, more consumer cultural awareness of what we're putting into our bodies, and our overall kind of general health and wellness as part of that. And I'd be interested in have you seen any tailwinds from a nutritional perspective, from conversations about food, what people are eating in the consumer world, from this kind of Maha sentiment that we've been talking about food supply so much more in recent months, years?
Kevin, there are like a couple questions layered in there, so I'm gonna
Yes,
do my
for sure.
best. The last question you asked was around tailwinds, and I would say we've absolutely seen tailwinds over the last decade. I joined Virta in 2016, and and look, this isn't an N=1 conversation, but we'll make it so for a minute here. And I got on the Virta treatment at the time just to try it out. And now I have been doing it for a decade. I felt so good. I lost about 20 pounds. And just for me personally, when I go to Costco and I go to the store, finding things, I'm also, but not only am I low carb, I'm also vegetarian. So finding things has become a lot easier, but that's just true across the board. I mean, as we have a very active patient community, people are constantly talking about what they've seen, what they've heard. I think, a decade ago when we would say things like sugar and processed foods and processed carbs are not that good for you, that was an education point for people, I think, and it took some convincing. It doesn't take as much convincing these days. People are kind of like, yeah, I get it, I see it, I've heard that through I've heard that not only from social media and Mahamud, but from the doctors. I think more and more people are accepting of that theory. And that approach. And so I would say that the broader acceptance, that broadly we see tailwinds. Now, one of the things that you mentioned that I think is a assumption that many people make is that it's way easier to get people to want to inject themselves or to get people to want to take a pill than it is to make lifestyle change. I actually don't think that is true. My experience is that has not been true. But by the way, I think painting any population with broad brushstrokes doesn't make sense. So I'll go back to my data. Is there a percentage of people that would rather take a pill or inject themselves or whatever? Sure. But I'm not sure that's the vast majority of the people that have this problem. And I'll go back to the 65% of people that want to lose weight, want to do so without these drugs. It turns out that the science that we've been trying to treat these people with has been wrong. We've been saying eat less and exercise more, starve yourself, and then feel good about it. Well, it's not surprising that that's actually not sustainable. And so what we have proven at Virta is that if you make the right changes, if you change what you eat and not starve yourself, actually just change the macronutrient balance of what you eat, shift your body to being way more efficient at burning fat as its primary fuel source, and eat to satiety while you do it, it's actually quite sustainable. And when it becomes sustainable and enjoyable, then I think more people are willing to do it. And so, I mean, that's that's also my N=1 story, right? Like I definitely, at the beginning thought it was really hard. And then as I got more used to it, I loved it. I mean, I feel so good. I know I've been on it for 10 years. And so that's kind of where I think what you just said is what I think our system is trained in. We're trained as providers and as a health system to do things fee for service, and the things that we can most easily do is provide pills and injections. And it's also what our pharmaceutical companies are experts at. It's like, hey, here again, I'll go back to high blood sugar, take these 4 meds. High blood pressure, take these 2 meds. Liver disease, take these meds, and that's what our system is built for. But if you think of changing behavior as something that can actually drive this value, people want to do it, and they just need help. They need to know how to do it. They need the support, the human support, as well as the in the moment support that we can provide. And when you do that, I think you can drive big change.
I'm excited to see more Super Bowl ads from Virta talking about these sort of changes versus all of the drugs that I can.
Is Health Tech Nerds gonna give us a Super Bowl? I'd love that, man.
We'll work on that for you, Amit.
The Health Tech Nerds Super Bowl. Amit, this has been so great. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and we'll catch up soon.
Kevin, Martin, I'm greatly appreciative. Thank you so much, guys.
Nice chatting.
Have a nice day.
Yep,
see ya.
Bye.
And now we're bringing on Michelle. Michelle from Here Now Health. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you both doing?
Doing great.
Awesome.
So I used to work for Medicaid, and I thought I knew a lot about Medicaid. And then we had our first conversation, and I learned about a whole new side of Medicaid that I did not know, which is that foster children are entitled to Medicaid, or youths that age out of. And in some states, it's run by special plans, like sort of carve out plans. Can you give us before we get into Here Now Health, which is fascinating, can you give us a little bit of a sort of history and overview of how Medicaid and the foster system interact today, in the past, and what the trends are?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're not alone, Martin, for starters. A lot of people that know a lot about Medicaid, this is actually new to them. And so if you think about it, we'll go back a little bit to what happens when a child comes into the foster system. And essentially what states are saying in those cases is that we can do a better job being this child's parents than their biological parents. And so, well, not getting too much into the politics of that, as a thesis, the state is literally taking custody of the child. And as that child's pseudo parents or caregivers, they then give that child their insurance. I mean, that's kind of the easiest way to look at this. And so children who come into the foster system are automatically eligible for that state's Medicaid program. And a lot of people don't realize this, but it's not just kids within the foster system. When youth age out of foster care, or they turn 18 and essentially become adults, and at that point, we're still in the custody of the state's child welfare system, they take that Medicaid with them. Much like if your child turns 18, they remain, eligible for your insurance while they're in college and oftentimes beyond. And so those youth stay on Medicaid until 26. The other subset is actually children that are adopted out of the foster system. Almost all children who are adopted out of foster care also remain eligible until 18 or even 21. So as we'll probably talk a little bit more about, my background for starting Here Now Health, my husband and I have 6 children. 4 are adopted out of foster care. Even though my husband is a naval officer, so all of our kids have TRICARE, our 4 who are adopted also have Medicaid until they're 21 here in the state of Virginia. And that is because their own connection to the foster system. So it's a federal mandate. And just kind of as a baseline for what we're talking about today, that eligibility is based on the child or that young adult's connection to the foster system, and not based on income requirements, not based on work requirements or anything really from their parents or the adults in their lives.
One just more level setting question from me on the foster program at large. You said federal mandate, but a lot of it sounds state implemented. Obviously, Medicaid has a lot of state dynamics and also federal dynamics. What's the federal government's role in the foster program right now, and how does it work with states in ensuring consistency across programs, and what's kind of current state of that federal state partnership?
Yeah, so we could talk for probably several hours about some of the nuances of this, but
Yes.
Really in its simplest form, federally, it's mandated that this population is covered. And just like almost everything else within Medicaid, states have a lot of kind of autonomy in how they roll it out, how they actually cover this population. So in some states, this kids or young adults are put on Medicaid plans just alongside any other eligible Medicaid members. So they're auto-enrolled. There might be 3 or 4 MCOs that are a part of that, broader Medicaid contract. The really interesting thing about this population is there's about 15, 16, 17, depending on how you look at it, states that actually take this population and they carve them out and create a specialized plan. And so most states call that either foster specialty plans or sole source plans. And they open it up as a competitive RFP. They're actually very competitive. Medicaid MCOs go after them pretty hard, and they're awarded as sole source contracts, typically for 5 years or longer. And so what that means is every child or young adult in a state that has Medicaid, because of their connection to the foster system, is on the same plan or is covered by that one MCO. So here in Virginia, Anthem Health Keepers owns that contract. And so all youth in the foster system adopted out and aged out are now on Anthem Health Keepers on that specialized plan. So that's where it gets really interesting from a kind of state by state perspective.
Can you give us some perspective on why it might make sense to do a carve out like this? What are the needs that foster connected youth or young adult have that are different from the sort of general Medicaid population?
Yeah. So what's really interesting about this, that another thing that kind of surprises a lot of people is that more conservative states actually champion this early. So Texas is actually, from my understanding, the first one that had a foster specialty plan. It was about 16, 17 years ago, and Centene has actually owned it the entire time. So they also have a lot of longevity with these contracts. And you can also kind of look at it as, okay, we have this population that we have to cover. Again, we don't have a choice because it's federally mandated. We have some autonomy as a state in how we're going to cover them. And so what it seems kind of like to me has happened is in some states that tend to have fluctuating coverage, especially for their pediatric population, they sort of take this population separately, say, okay, if we put them on a separate plan, we can follow those, again, federal mandates, we can make sure they're covered, even if the coverage for the rest of our pediatric Medicaid population may not be super consistent. And so that's where we've seen, again, it's sometimes states that actually don't have the best Medicaid coverage for their pediatrics that have these specialized plans, but it's become more diverse. You've got states like Illinois, Washington, North Carolina was a newcomer in 2025. So it's geographically, politically pretty diverse in terms of who has sole source plans. From the need aspect, you've got a population that tends to have very high levels of, both physical and mental health needs. You've got teens in foster care that have up to 80% of mental health diagnoses as a population as a whole. You also have very low levels of access. So there's a lot of transiency. So if you think about it, one of the aspects of a child or really anyone's life that make it difficult to have continued healthcare access is transiency. So a child or an adult, if they move pretty frequently, it makes it very hard, everything from wait lists to having consistent providers to having providers that know medical history. And so that's a very common thing, of course, for children within the foster system is to have a lot of moves, unfortunately, or a lot of transiency. So when you couple those higher acuity needs, higher diagnosis rates, less stability, you really kind of come up with a oftentimes perfect storm for not getting great care. And that's a lot of what these sole source plans are really built around fixing.
Michelle, I wanted to turn a little bit more to Here Now and the model that y'all are building there. It's funny, having written about the healthcare innovation space writ large for every weekend for 10 years now, foster care is not something that I think has ever come up before. Mm-hmm. Not that, it's not an important program, but you don't see much startup activity targeting the space. I would love to hear how you thought about approaching the foster care market, how you, as my understanding is, virtual care model for mental health for foster kids. How did you land on that as the initial build out? How are you thinking about the model? What is Here Now up to today? How does the business look like at this moment?
Yeah. So it was really intentional, the build out, I will say. I've been in healthcare my whole career. I spent about 6 years helping to build a company called Hazel Health, the largest provider of school-based telemedicine. So, a lot of my background was in pediatric virtual behavioral health. But the background on Here Now really goes back in 2013. My husband and I became foster parents in the state of Georgia. And over about 5 years, we fostered over 40 children. 4 of our 6, as I mentioned, are adopted out of foster care. And when we closed our home to fostering, I became a CASA volunteer or court-appointed special advocate. advocating for system impacted families in the juvenile justice system. So I had, different interactions, different roles kind of within the child welfare system across several years. And what I found was, even though I was working in the healthcare system every day, I was literally working at an FQHC while we were foster parents. So at the ground level of safety net care. And I had, access arguably, more than most people to the healthcare system. I was failing to get kids in our own home the mental health care they needed. And it wasn't a coverage issue. 100% of kids, of course, that came to us were covered by Medicaid, but it was literally everything else. We would almost never get a Medicaid card with them. And so I'd go to sign them up, and community providers would say, oh, until you have a physical Medicaid card, we can't put them on an intake list. Or I'd have different birth dates on different forms that were given to me. So we literally would not know which one was the correct birthday or which one was given to Medicaid to be able to match that up. And then just wait lists. We had one therapist in our county in North Georgia who accepted Medicaid, and he oftentimes had a 6-month wait list, not to mention he was an older white male. So a lot of our teens and middle schoolers, especially our females that came to us, weren't comfortable opening up, especially ones that had been victims of males. And so there were just all of these different things that would keep us from getting kids in care. And then we saw the escalation. We were constantly told to go to the emergency room because, again, we have a really high level of accountability for this population. So the child welfare system, our caseworkers would say, if all else fails, just go to the ER. They can't turn you away. But then you see kids who show up to the emergency room for behavioral health issues, they get hospitalized. They end up in residential care. And oftentimes because it's the only bed for them to sleep in, because we have to have a bed for kids in foster care to sleep. And so it was, again, I was seeing this kind of unravel in front of my eyes. Later on, I found the stat that we spend about 10x the medical spend on behavioral health for kids who have a foster care connection in comparison to the rest of Medicaid. And it makes sense, right? I saw we were paying for it in crisis care. We were constantly at the emergency room. Kids were being hospitalized and not released simply because they had nowhere to go. So I started to just ideate, like, what would it look like if we did this better? This is a population where if you talk to almost anyone in a state, politicians, stakeholders, Medicaid, and you ask them, who are you most concerned about when it comes to our youth? They will almost inevitably say kids that are in the foster system or kids that are connected. And so I knew that the desire was there to do better. But like you said, Kevin, no one is innovating in this space. And so I just started to look at it as like, what would make this make sense? And so intentionally virtual, really specialized care that we can get to kids early and often. So within 48 hours when they enter the foster system, that can stay with them even if they move. So kids don't have to retell their story, was what I knew was needed. And I knew that we had done this in other areas within virtual care. It had just never been built truly for the foster system. And so that is what Here Now Health is. We provide intentionally virtual specialized care early and often for any child or young adult that has their Medicaid because of their foster care connection. We partner with specialized Medicaid health plans that hold these sole source contracts to not only help improve their outcomes, but reduce their costs by preventing the crisis care that we know happens too often. And we include caregivers. So if that is a foster mom, if that is a grandma that has custody, if that is a bio dad that's working a case plan to get their child back home, we include that adult because we know that that is the only way to really stabilize the child's world.
I know we have you a couple minutes after time. If you have a couple more minutes.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Great. I would be curious to hear a little bit about, so it seems like there's a sort of nice benefit from having a sole source contract in that you have a single payer that you're working with, so you can get them the help right away and intervene right away. I'm curious how you go about like the sort of contracting with them? Like historically, Medicaid, it's been hard to get providers, not just because of regions, but also just because the reimbursement rates are low. I'm curious
Right.
how you kind of address that and get these foster impacted youth and their caregivers the sort of level of care that they deserve.
Yeah. So when it comes to getting them the level of care, we often say we don't take no for an answer. We are built around the realities of foster impacted youth, and you can't do that by accident. You have to really intentionally build it from the ground up, and that goes from everything from our technology and our product. We have a no login experience, and that was intentional because as a foster mom, I was locked out of almost every single child's EMR account that came into our home because that EMR was set up by 3 foster homes ago and nobody could get the login. And so we intentionally built a login free experience. And that's really hard from a product standpoint. It's not easy to do, but again, we did it really intentionally from the beginning. Our care model, we built alongside the Florida Institute for Child Welfare based on very specific research that showed what clinical models work within this population. And so I just believe very strongly that you can't accidentally do well by this population. We have a less than 10% no-show rate. And in Medicaid across the board, it's typically around 30 to 40%. But we call our aged out youth the day before their appointments and tell them we're excited to see them. We help our teens and aged out youth oftentimes get a no-cost cell phone from their Medicaid health plans because they aren't able to join their sessions when their cell phone gets cut off. We have gotten our therapists licensed in new states when a child is getting moved to a kinship or a family placement in a new state so they can continue with that care. We do whatever needs to be done. And so we go to health plans and we let them know that there's no one size fits all fix when it comes to this population. We are going to uniquely care for every family that we work with. And in doing so, we're again going to help them improve their outcomes and therefore re-win these sole source contracts and save on behavioral health costs. But they have to work with us in kind of the same kind of unique way that we are supporting their families.
I would imagine it is a lot less expensive for them to pay your therapists good rates than it is to have foster children staying in inpatient psychiatric.
Exactly. They pay about the same for one full month of Here Now Health care as they do for one day in a residential setting. So it's that 1 to 30 ratio that is helpful. We are truly the lowest cost care. And that's our thesis. We believe that most kids actually need lower cost care. They don't need IOP. They don't need hospitalization. They need a really healthy therapeutic relationship from day one. Because again, we're dealing with a population that has 80% plus mental health diagnoses, and they deserve the very best care.
Yeah. Michelle, last question from me. Kudos to you for focusing on this. Like, this is really cool. I love this conversation. But I'm curious, what's biggest bottleneck that stops this from being available to every foster kid in the country today? Like, what do we need to solve so that programs like this can roll out to more of the population? Because it seems like such a unambiguously good thing to me that we should have more of.
Yeah. So I would say, like, for us personally, it is that state by state, we have to have buy-in from that health plan. And as you all know, that even if you can say, look, we're almost guaranteeing you lower costs in the long run, it's still not usually a simple conversation. Contracting and credentialing, is not easy with Medicaid. And so we are going by a state by state strategy of where can we have truly the largest impact? Where can we have a really deep partnership? Because we're building to be the healthcare partner of these Medicaid MCOs. We're not just building to be a telehealth vendor. And so we're very strategically launching state by state, and we're not trying to just do a land grab of how can we get into 50 states in the next 2 to 3 years. But from more systematic, I would say that, again, states have autonomy for how they covered this population. And so more and more states are moving toward sole source plans. Again, we had the very first one about 16, 17 years ago, and now we have 17 plus with a few RFPs coming up in the next year. So states are realizing it's a good way to cover this population with the care they need and deserve. And it's also a good way to hold a health plan accountable for, we're going to give you this whole population. But I would say that's also the risk. Like that's the benefit and the risk, right? If you're going to have a sole source contract, you have to hold that sole source owner to a very high level of accountability because they don't have competition. And so I would just say that's the risk to flag when it comes to states, is if you're going to do this, you have to do it well. And you have to really hold that, Medicaid MCO accountable for providing the care that they're obligated to provide, I guess.
I lied. Can I ask one quick follow-up on that?
Absolutely.
I think keep going on.
Hey, I've got all day, Kevin. Yeah.
Who at the state Medicaid agencies is responsible for this? Like, is there a team that is overseeing foster care and that relationship with that MCO? Is this like one person who has broader responsibilities at side a desk for them? Like, what is the current state of the state Medicaid agency and resourcing for this program?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and it's typically a few people, and sometimes just like it's a little different in each state. I'll use North Carolina for an example. The former Secretary Cody Kinsley was really the champion for the RFP that came out a couple of years ago, and he really intentionally, I know he was one of the ones that really intentionally built in. So it's usually a mix of the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Medicaid director, the Commissioner for Behavioral Health, kind of a mix of who's really involved in creating the Medicaid RFPs that go out and how they design them. And so just using that as an example, I know he was a really big champion for how the state of North Carolina designed their most recent RFP, which is where they implemented the state's first specialty plan. And the one other thing I'll say about that, which is what I'll create a question for myself of what should happen more often in states, or what would I love to see more often in states, is that they're using it more for prevention. So the foster specialty plan in North Carolina doesn't just cover kids in foster care, aged out youth, and those adopted. It actually covers kids on safety and family preservation plans. So what that means is, if a family is being investigated for suspected abuse or neglect, and there's something that's found to be a risk, but not enough to pull that child into foster care. So they usually create a safety or preservation plan. And what that means is, we're going to keep an eye on this family, but we're going to try to give them the resources to stay together. One of those resources they give them now in the state of North Carolina is Medicaid coverage for the children. And think about that. It makes so much sense. If not having health care is a reason we're going to pull a child into foster care. And this happened to us. We had a teen that came to us because her grandma couldn't get her the mental health care they needed. Why would we not just give them that health care at home? Keep that family together. It's cheaper. It's better for the child. It's better for the family. So now that's written into the foster specialty plan eligibility in North Carolina. So a child in the home that's at risk of foster care is put on the foster specialty plan, so they can then access a broader array of the healthcare services they need. It also does something really cool, which is it's going to be providing coverage actually for the parents. So anything that would keep, again, that family from being separated is able to be billed to the child's Medicaid. So again, like, the more we can funnel this Medicaid coverage to prevention, the better for families, and in the long run, the cheaper for states as well. So I kind of like created my last two questions. I hope it's okay.
Absolutely. I think we're already looking forward to having you back, watching the story closely. But in the meantime, where can people find you if they want to learn more, or are a state Medicaid director and want to bring Here Now Health to their state?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Here Now Health. My email is michelle@herenow.health. That's also our web address. And you can go on there. You can actually see our referral form and how simple we've made it. Again, as just that intentionality behind making it as accessible and low to no barrier as possible. But I'd love to chat, whether it's about, bringing Here Now Health to your state, or even just Medicaid policy, child welfare, you name it. I'm game.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time today, Michelle.
Absolutely.
Appreciate you,
Thanks
Michelle.
a lot. Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks, Kevin and
See ya.
Martin.
Bye.
Appreciate it.
What a cool place to end.
I'm excited.
Yeah,
That is awesome.
No, I'm really excited. And it's like a sort of, in what was not maybe the most uplifting episode, what a cool and inspiring place to end. Kevin, if folks want to have conversations like this and others, what's the best place for them to get in on it?
healthtechnerds.com. Come join our community, 30,000 people talking shop about what's going on in the space, learning from brilliant people like Michelle who are working on really cool problems and trying to solve them. So come join us there.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone.